Welcome or welcome back to Auckland's first Raising the Bar event, brought to you by the University of Auckland. For those of you who've just joined us, my name is Victoria Brownlee and I am your MC for this evening. We've had an absolutely fantastic first half to the night and I'm sure that the second half is going to be just as amazing. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you all know we're running a social media competition tonight. If you post a picture on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter using the hashtag RTBAKL, you can be in to win one of 5 Westfield vouchers. I would now like to introduce to you our speaker, Davinia, who is going to be talking on the death of the music critic. Please join me in welcoming Davinia.
Okay, thank you for coming. Special thanks to those who invited me to be here. It's quite a privilege to get to talk to people whilst they're drinking and eating down there at the back. And I quite fancied the look of, I jotted it down here, drones and the politics of killing over at the Tom Tom Bar. So I know what we've all given up to be here. The politics of killing, in fact, could well have been the subtitle of my talk. For at least in the opening few minutes, I'm concerned with death. Extinction, kicking the bucket. You might remember that Roger Moore, otherwise known as 007, died a few months ago. Aged 89, the English knight, who was one of the longest serving actors to play James Bond. He lost an intense but short battle with cancer. A bit of a Bond fan, I watched his last outing in Homage, A View to a Kill, memorable as much for Bond as for the baddie Zorin, who was played by Christopher Walken, and the badass Grace Jones as Mayday. 2 things struck me on this viewing. Did you know that the title song, written by John Barry and the English band Duran Duran, this was actually recorded in 2 separate parts. It was 2 separate entities. The band did their bit at the Maison Rouge studios in London, whilst Barry worked with the orchestra and then did the bulk of the orchestral rearranging elsewhere. Can you tell, maybe, from the sound of it? We're going to hear a little bit of it now. This is the start, I hope, of A View to a Kill by Duran Duran. It's awkward, isn't it? Sitting still, silent, ponderous, not knowing what to do with your hands, not knowing where to look, what to think. To one of the best pop anthems, I think, of the 1980s. You want to stand up, move along, sing along. Indeed, if there was ever a music made for quasi-concert hall listening, it wasn't this. This, so I'm told, is synth pop plus dance electronica, a reaction from the austerity of punk and an open celebration of gloss, glam, artifice. In fact, critics called Duran Duran the new narcissists, the romantic rebels. Yes, they seemed, at least visually, to gesture back to the 19th century dandy, a made-up, well-dressed figure of inscrutable, self-satisfied character. But musically, Duran Duran were unashamedly commercial. They oozed a newness and a futurism that could only really be sustained by the latest electronic equipment and by MTV. It was this contemporary aspect, perhaps, that killed off the new romantic musical movement back in the mid-80s as the synth pop style was gradually eclipsed in the UK by indie rock bands such as the Smiths. So from one death to another, my second point of note about the Bond film came courtesy of something like uselessmoviefacts.com. Apparently the title, View to a Kill, is a reference not just to one of Ian Fleming, Bond creators, not just to one of his many stories, but to an old fox hunting song. The words of which go like this: from a find to a check, from a check to a view to a kill in the morning. A step-by-step guide, then, to hunting, a structured metaphor for murder. The title makes a good deal of sense in terms of the movie's plot. Zorin, if you remember, is the fox hunter, Mayday is his trusty hound, and Bond is there to be sniffed out. He's the prey. But does it make sense here in this talk? What's the Bond film, the title specifically, got to do with my little spiel this evening? This is a little talk that starts out with another death, that of the music critic, the paid professional. It's certainly more than mere hearsay. According to the leading US critic, Alex Ross, numbers have been falling steadily over the last couple of decades, to the point where nowadays fewer than 10 national newspapers in the US employ full-time classical critics. Why? Some commentators blame modern technology. Music, they argue, is so widely, so freely available, so easy to consume, that the primary function of the critic, this being to describe a record, to assess its value and its significance for an unknowing public, this function is all but obsolete. In plainer terms, the public doesn't need a description, doesn't need an assessment. It can hear the music for itself, for free, and it can be a critic, too. Thanks to the burgeoning popularity of social media, listeners are used to offering their opinions quickly, frantically, and offering them not in paragraphs, sentences, or even in words, but in data. Likes, stars, and symbols such as emoticons that tend to mask individual reactions with the anonymous and defensive group identity of fanhood. Music criticism, as a result, degenerates into illiteracy, a glossy veneer of computerized data that seems to mock the traditional procedure, now hopelessly quaint, of writing. So what to do? Of course, I'm going to advocate for the worth and the wonder of words, the kind of writing about music that I try to teach at university. A writing that, yes, does aim to discuss, describe, and analyze music with reference to technical, theoretical vocabulary, words such as texture, harmony, melody, secondary dominant, etc. But also I try and encourage my students to develop a writing that is open to the potentiality of metaphor and simile, of narrative and fiction, analogic perspectives that can help us conceptualize music, not only what it sounds like, but what it's doing, how it's functioning, how it communicates. Clearly, there are other reasons to want to sustain the practice of music criticism. I've heard it said on more than one occasion that criticism is our first and last line of defense against the manufactured consensus, the only antidote to paid publicity. Then there's another saying, often attributed to Oscar Wilde, the critic as artist. I often trot out bits of Oscar Wilde's 1891 essay, The Critic as Artist, when trying to convince my students of the essential artistry of criticism, decent, engaging writing. In fact, criticism, I believe, can be as creative and as compelling as any artwork being critiqued. Moreover, like any artwork, it too can help extend our imaginative reach, can help open new doors, new windows onto what Wilde called oneself and one's soul. I'll give you a couple of examples here this evening. Extracts of music criticism, written centuries apart, that have led me to some of the deepest, most real and probably revealing kind of listener experience. First comes a figure who will be known to music aficionados, Eta Hoffmann, a noted German music critic of the early 19th century, and one who's still notable today, thanks to the enduring influence and impact of his words. And his worlds, the mysterious, remote, and entirely fictive worlds he conjures in florid, metaphorical, and sometimes waffling prose. In fact, music's otherworldliness is a central theme of Hoffmann's writing. Is not music, he asks, the mysterious language of a faraway spirit world whose wondrous accents, echoing within us, awaken us to a higher, more intensive life? In a now famous review of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, published in 1810 in a popular Leipzig-based music magazine, Hoffmann finds his ultimate artist hero, a Beethoven whose music can, quote, raise us involuntarily to the light-filled regions of a higher unknown world. It's funny, I like to play the opening of Beethoven's Fifth to my students and get them to share their initial impressions. Inevitably, someone will talk about Kubrick, Stanley Kubrick, and Clockwork Orange. Someone will hum the famous opening motif, da-da-da-da, and supposedly, reference this to fate knocking on Beethoven's door. Once, and this made me laugh, a student actually recalled Beethoven the movie, the one with the massive dog, a St. Bernard called Beethoven, who apparently barks whenever the Fifth Symphony is played. You can bark along now if you want to. To Hoffmann, this is music from an unknown realm, Music that sweeps the listener into the wonderful spirit world of the infinite, offering some sort of refuge, I think, from the sort of social and political drudgery of daily life. Indeed, this ability of music to be coercive, to have some sort of power over listeners, a psychological power, but also a physiological power. You know, it can make your body do things. This was another prominent theme of Hoffmann's. In his review, the critic describes music as an animate object. He says, Beethoven's music sets in motion the machinery of awe, fear, terror, and pain, and awakens that infinite yearning, which is the essence of romanticism. And that last word, romanticism, is important. For Hoffmann's prose, in fact, you might call it poetry, betrays the central principles of early 19th century romanticism, an ism that, as I often tell my students, is best understood as a sort of intellectual orientation or an artistic ideal rather than a defined and closed historical period. With its exaltation of emotion over reason, the senses over the intellect, individual creativity over strict adherence to formal rules, Hoffmann's review is exemplary. And so too is his description of music as infinite. Listeners, we are visionaries. Our imagination is a gateway to a transcendental, sort of spiritual experience. Other listeners spoke similarly, including 19th century composers. You might have heard of them: Hector, Berlioz, Franz, Liszt, and Richard Wagner. Berlioz, Frenchman Berlioz, was also a prominent critic. He described how music could open the pearly gates of what he called a poetic heaven, far from the prosaic world of language, reason, and intellect. And this sort of dichotomy between the two, between the poeticism of heaven and language, reason, rationality, intellect. The Hungarian Liszt, a virtuoso pianist, said very much the same thing, pitting music as feeling, living and breathing emotion against word, deed, and my favorite, the demon thought. Now, as for Wagner, well, the German composer also described Beethoven's symphonies. In fact, Wagner thought they were more like veritable poems. He described them as revelations from another world. The composer, in fact, crafted a now familiar narrative, one in which the dark side was represented by the intellect, by logic-mongering reason, and the march of thought. The other side, the force, this was strong, not so much with Beethoven, but with Wagner himself. Blessed with the gift of self-promotion, before Brand Beckham, there was Brand Wagner, and Wagner believed that he was the true heir, the true successor to Beethoven. More specifically, he promoted the value and historical legitimacy of his own operas, though he called them music dramas, as the only possible continuation of the Western symphonic tradition. Let's hear one of Wagner's orchestral favorites. There's a big story going on there. In fact, maybe a few big stories. On stage there in Wagner's opera, The Twilight of the Gods from the Ring cycle, we witness the death and funeral march of one of the central characters in this phenomenon that is The Ring, an operatic quadrilogy written on a libretto by the composer himself, based on Norse mythology. It's interesting, there's a wonderful production that's freely available, I think, on YouTube and other wonderful bits of software, where at that very moment, Siegfried, one of the characters, has died, and this is supposed to be his funeral march. And all the characters, the sort of backing characters, there's a better word for them, but I've forgotten, the chorus, there we go. They come onto the stage and they stand there, and that's all they do. They just stand there looking out into the theatre. So imagine if, as you were listening to that then, you didn't just have me standing here looking like a bit of a fool, but you had a whole heap of chorus members just sort of looking like this. It's an absolutely wonderful production by Patrice Sterot, a French sort of theatre director. He made his name in theatre, that was staged at Bayreuth not so long ago. There's a second story for me too, one that I think is actually a bit more dramatic, a bit more engaging, a bit more compelling. And if I can turn my page over, I'll tell you what it is. And it's nothing to do with Wagner's gods, dwarves and dodgy domestic politics. Who ever heard of selling your sister-in-law? But now you come to mention it. This second story is happening not so much on the stage, but down in the sunken orchestral pit. And it's a story about the so-called death of opera in the late 19th century. More specifically, critics of the period, French critics, spoke of symphonisation, that opera was sort of symphonizing itself. And they also spoke of the simultaneous sort of programming of the symphony. So we have opera as a genre edging towards the symphony becoming ever more operatic. It makes for a wonderful musical tussle. Now, my second piece of criticism deals with some of these same themes. Lester Bangs, an American rock critic, was perhaps as controversial a figure in his time as Richard Wagner himself, contributing to some of the most well-read music magazines in the United States, Rolling Stone, NME, New York's Village Voice. Bangs was known for an uber-emotional approach, a wild, passionate love of music that, when combined with alcohol, drugs, and some extreme irreverent language, had him banned from the pages of some publications. Lester Bangs died in 1982, in his 30s. In fact, he was younger than I am now. A rock star as much as a rock critic. Indeed, he was immortalized in a fictional portrayal by Philip Seymour Hoffman, who also died not so long ago with drugs involved, in the Cameron Crowe 2000 film, Almost Famous. You may have seen it. Bang's most iconic essay was a review of Van Morrison's 1968 album, Astral Weeks. And interestingly, in the context of this little talk, Bangs penned and published this essay almost 10 years after the album's release. So a good deal of time had passed before he put pen to paper. And in fact, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of paper. There's about 5 A4 sheets. In his characteristically rambling and sort of stream of consciousness style, Bangs describes his state of mind on hearing Van Morrison's album for the first time. He writes, 1968, I was a physical and mental wreck, nerves shredded, ghosts and spiders looming and squatting across my mind. It's lovely imagery. Or perhaps not so lovely. This personal aspect intrudes quite forcibly into the review, as Bangs documents his various musical encounters with Van Morrison, tracks and TV performances. But it's the way he theorizes outward from personal experience that's become so defining and characteristic of Bang's writing. The way he seems to bridge this chasm, real or maybe just imagined, between the personal and the expansive, the individual and the collective, suggesting that we are all the same consciousness, filtering the same material, succumbing to the same life experience. Astral Weeks, Bangs wrote, is a record about people stunned with life, completely overwhelmed, stalled in their skins, their ages and selves, paralyzed by the enormity of what in one moment of vision they can comprehend. Here's a track from the album called Madame George. What Bangs heard in Astral Weeks, which is a compendium of seemingly idiosyncratic pieces that is widely held to be Van Morrison's masterpiece. What he heard was more than a heady mix of jazz, blues, folk and poetry. He heard, I'll quote, illumination, redemption, timelessness, beauty, destruction, the universality of the abyss. In some, he heard the same truths of humanity that weighed so heavily on the imaginations of Wagner, Liszt, Berlioz, and Hoffmann. Bangs, too, speaks of rapture and anguish, awe and hurt, as if the music was casting a searchlight onto basic human emotions, onto the miracle and the mortality of life. And Bangs, too, describes listeners as visionaries, seeing, searching, glimpsing and following the music, which is a beacon that illuminates mental processes, what he calls the far shores of the murk. The musical experience, Bangs suggests, boils down to one single moment, a moment's recognition of life's fundamental duality. In his own words, a moment's knowledge of the miracle of life with its inevitable simultaneous, a glimpse of the capacity to be hurt and the capacity to inflict that hurt. Now here we might circle back in time, for I'm reminded of the movie title with which I began. A View to a Kill, or as the film was known in German translation, I think, In the Face of Death, or something like that. Certainly the title doesn't help us process the depth of the title of my talk. The music critic, that dying species, hasn't been hunted out in a deliberate, well-planned execution, one that involved care, attention, preparation, thoughtful observation, patience, focus, and relentless pursuit. But the fox hunting analogy might still be useful. For what is criticism, if not deliberate and well-planned, careful and attentive, thoughtful, patient, and intent? And what is the goal of the critic, if not to capture, to seize, grasp, take hold of, look in the eye of, and stare down at the object of his or her attention? Following Bangs, Wagner, Hoffmann, and co., we might envisage music listeners as visionaries, music as that searchlight, or maybe a sniffer dog, a gun dog like Mayday, locked onto a scent, relentless again in pursuit. It's the critic's job to track and trace, to follow where the music leads and bask in the reward. For Bangs, it's sensational. Our guts are knotted up. We're crazed and clawing for more, but we damn well know we've seen something and we've felt something. A View to a Kill, then, might not signal the death of music criticism, but it might signal its salvation. Thank you. Yeah, now it's your turn to talk. I can even give you the microphone because it comes off. Or not. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that the death of the critic has come about as a written form with the introduction of things like social media and everything like that.
So it's been said, yes.
What would you say? Because I've noticed there has been, while not necessarily a published format, there is still the existence of music criticism in other forms of social media. For example, the needle drop on YouTube is a really
Yep.
music critic on YouTube, millions of thousands of millions of followers.
Yep.
His job is literally just to critique albums and everything, but instead of it being a written format, it's just visual, auditory.
Yeah.
Say that the criticism that the critic is dead isn't necessarily dead, just being reborn.
Yeah, I think I was thinking mainly of the newspaper, the press critic. Like you say, there is some wonderful stuff online. There's a few really good music history sites. One of them's got the Hitchcock title, Dial M for Musicology. That's a pretty cool, trendy site for me and my students, which is full of great criticism. Some students, general fans, and academics who are writing in a different format, probably for a different reader. But yeah, I was thinking more of the sort of music review that we find nowadays in a daily newspaper, if we're lucky, and how those sorts of columns are really having a tough time because, of course, reviewers want to review what's going on in a city, in Auckland, for example. A reviewer wants to give the reader, give the newspaper audience, if you like, a sense of what's been going on. But where I think it's sort of failing, if I dare say failing, or where I think it could do better, is in situating those musical things that are happening in Auckland in a bigger context, yeah? One of the only ways we make meaning out of anything in life, gosh, I'm getting very philosophical, is if we contextualize it, yeah? And we position it in relationship to something else. So some of the things that are going on in Auckland are fabulous, yes, but let's see them talked about in a wider, maybe even a global perspective, so the reader can begin to get a sense of not just what's going on here, but how it relates to the world, which is what, since I've arrived in New Zealand, everyone here seems to be almost obsessed by. Certainly in the university they are. The university is some sort of global institution. So maybe there's sort of scope there for a bit more sort of rigorous contextualizing of what's going on in Auckland compared to what's going on in Venice or in Sarajevo or anywhere. Let's have a little bit more breadth. Yeah.
Do you think there's a reason that maybe
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good question about whether or not New Zealand audiences, listeners, spectators are more or less concerned with what's going on nationally as what's going on globally. It makes me think of a few weird experiences I've had in my job here, where I have postgraduate students who come to see me and they say, oh, I want to do a dissertation on New Zealand film music. And my heart always just sinks. I think, oh, holy crap, not another dissertation on New Zealand film music. There is in the music community a very strong desire to formulate some sort of theory for New Zealand musicness, and people like want to package it and then send it off out into the world. It's very difficult from a sort of critic scholarly perspective to make persuasive arguments in this day and age for the sort of national identity of any musical idiom. Yeah, I think the cases that I've got in my head are people who are extraordinarily passionate about their country. And the person I particularly got in my head, who did a very interesting dissertation on New Zealand film music, was always sort of, well, for me, she was weighed down with this business of nationalism, but I think she thought it was her duty to try and write an account of how New Zealand-born composers had tried to craft a different sort of film music. And she talked about a whole heap of different films, from Lord of the Rings, you know, to the more obscure stuff. As for whether or not New Zealand sort of music people are interested in global things, that brings me to another work-based experience. Most of the teaching that I do here is all Western European. I rarely teach outside the Western European canon, mainly because so-called classical music is a Western European phenomenon. And in fact, pretty much all my colleagues in the sort of history department do the same. But we are more and more aware nowadays of the need not just to include some sort of core of New Zealand music history, but also to make that core sort of resonate on a broader plane. So a lot of the issues with what we teach in these business of nationalism and globalization comes through in sort of trying to deal not only with students who want exposure to different things, but with the sort of long, heavy-duty backstory of classical music that we're sort of always carting around with us. Yeah, at the back. You might have to shout.
Do you think that the music blogger is an adequate substitute or successor to the traditional music critic?
Definitely. Why not? The more of them, the merrier. I mean, if somebody's willing to devote their time to writing with words in a sentence, I'm all for sentences and paragraphs, then, you know, I'll have 10 of them in my class tomorrow, please. Yeah, totally. I don't have any problem with music bloggers. I don't see why anybody should have any problem with any sort of attempt to, you know, to verbalize, to write down what is something music that is damn hard to write about. You know, the biggest thing that I struggle with and that my students struggle with is to try and find words to describe what they hear. They can come and tell me about this composer and his influences and, oh yes, he had tea with this person, blah, blah, blah. They can tell me all the backstory, but what they really struggle to do is to translate sound into words. And it's hard. Yeah, it's hard, particularly if you're not familiar with the technical, theoretical language I mentioned earlier. But like I also said, there is potential for writing, I think, in a different way if we are open to the potential, as I said, of metaphor, of simile, of using these analogic sort of perspectives to compare and contrast what's music's doing to what's going on in the other art forms. That's often a key way, actually, in which I hopefully help my students think about what music's doing, is to compare it to what painting's doing, or what a poem is doing, or what a sculpture is doing. So that sort of inter-art literacy is pretty cool, You know, I'm just waiting for my Prosecco, but, you know, I'll wait a little bit longer. Shall I go and get my Prosecco? Yes, let me go get my Prosecco. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And just perhaps you can give another round of applause to all the wonderful people from the University of Auckland who've put on this night, which is going on in all these different bars across the city. They've done a fabulous job.
Thank you, Davinia, for that wonderful talk and for sharing all of your research with us. That was just, yeah, incredible. I was sitting right at the back, but I was listening, and I thought it was just amazing. So that brings an end to Raising the Bar 2017. On behalf of the University of Auckland, I just want to thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I hope you had a fun and informative time. Feel free to stay around for another drink, and do keep an eye out for Raising the Bar 2018. If you are needing a ride home tonight, the Zoomy app is offering a 20% off discount for Raising the Bar guests. All you need to do is download the app and enter the code RTBAKL. And that brings us to a close. Inohora, everybody, and have a safe journey home.